here in Washington, D.C. And for you here in the audience, and there are many more watching on a live stream across the country, welcome to the launch of the AAUW's latest research report, Barriers and Bias, the Status of Women in Leadership. You might have noticed that America is changing this election year. If you didn't notice it, you're in a cave. So if you take a look at the front pages, at Twitter topics, tune into the news, you wouldn't be wrong to come to the conclusion the country's changed a lot. But one way that it is not particularly changing is in gender inequities. Women are more than half of the American electorate. And as you well know, we have never elected a woman president, but only about 19% of our Congress is female, 12% of our governors. Women are half of the modern workforce, but only 5% of the Fortune 500 CEOs. And women make up more than half of today's college graduates and more than 2/3 of graduate school graduates, and are barely more than a quarter of college presidents. So we're looking at this leadership gap in so many sectors that we wanted to take a look at what harm it does to the whole society, what can we do about it? And so that's what brings us together here today. AAUW's new Barriers and Bias research report, which was released today, draws from scholarly literature and pays special attention to the role of stereotypes and bias as it explores these questions and provides real, actionable recommendations for how to solve the problem. So let's take a look.
Hundreds of thousands of articles and books are written about women in leadership, but most of it focuses on fixing women rather than fixing the problem. What we've done at AAUW with this report is to look instead at the barriers and biases women face in leadership.
In 2015, only 5% of the companies in Standard & Poor's 500 list had female chief executive officers. That's 25 people out of 500. And can you guess how many US states had women governors? 6 out of 50. Those are the people elected to represent our country.
Women are also underrepresented as leaders in academia, unions, the legal profession, and more. And the numbers are even lower for women of color. Black and Hispanic women together make up less than 3% of the senior executives in the private sector.
What's really troubling about these numbers is not just the lack of diversity. It's the long history of the problem.
Women are not new to leadership. Think of Cleopatra or Queen Elizabeth. Think of the women who helped to lead the civil rights movement and the educational reform movements.
But women leaders are still, even after thousands of years, vastly outnumbered by men.
The leadership gender gap is significant, persistent, and pervasive. Leadership ladders across many occupational sectors today continue to reflect a pattern of gender disparity that narrows the pool of women available to rise to the top leadership positions in the future.
As we examine this gender gap, we realize that despite many efforts to improve opportunities, there must be some systemic factors that are contributing to gender inequality in leadership roles.
Women make up more than half of college grads and half the labor force, and they have long careers in many fields. So there's no lack of women to fill these leadership positions, but somehow they're still not represented at the upper levels.
There are lots of barriers that contribute to the problem, including a lack of family-friendly policies, explicit gender-based discrimination, and a lack of mentors and sponsors. But a barrier that we have come to see as hugely important is unconscious or implicit bias.
You may not even be aware of them, but these are the hidden biases that can cloud your judgment and make it more difficult to treat people fairly. Such unconscious biases may even affect your decisions and actions in ways that diverge from your conscious beliefs and values.
In 1998, the Harvard University's Project Implicit pioneered the development of tests that used word association to detect implicit bias. In conjunction with our barriers and bias research, AAUW has collaborated with Harvard to launch a free, online, anonymous implicit association test on gender and leadership. We invite everyone to take it by going to our website at www.aauw.org.
Like other implicit association tests, the AAUW test measures the time it takes your mind to connect two words. For example, the test might tell you to connect leader with man. The test is not asking you to agree with the word connection. It is simply measuring how long it takes your mind to make the connection. You can go to our website, www.aauw.org, to take the test.
So why is implicit bias so important? All of us have implicit biases to some degree. This doesn't necessarily mean we'll discriminate against someone. It just means that our first blink judgment or implicit response sends us certain information.
Acknowledging this blink is critical because research suggests that by getting to know your own biases, you can learn to counteract them. The bad news is that most people have unconscious bias. But the good news is that there's something we can do about it.
The report is full of recommendations for action. There's a lot that both the government and employers can do to make sure women can stay on their career tracks and return to those careers if they leave. In terms of public policy, we recommend several pieces of legislation that promote work-life balance and workplace gender equity.
Our report includes things individuals can do as well. You can learn about your hidden bias by taking our test, for example. When we identify our biases, we can start challenging them.
Clearly, time will not solve the gender leadership gap, but action will. Getting more women leaders will require major changes in the culture, policies, and practices of the places where women learn and work. Accountability can also inspire action, so we need public policies to ensure that employers do the right thing.
The leadership gender gap is persistent and pervasive, but solvable.
That's it for our sneak peek. We hope you enjoy reading the full report.
So the question is, how do these biases and barriers affect our society? How do they affect business, education, politics? We have a fabulous panel here to talk about those things and what role these implicit associations that we just saw about in the video play, and how we can go about closing this leadership gap. So our panel: President and Chief Executive Officer of Rolls-Royce North America, Marion Blakey; NASA Administrator and former astronaut, Charles Bolden; veteran award show producer and founder of Sunset Lane Entertainment, Sally Frattini; behavioral scientist and policy advisor at the National Institutes of Health, Anna Hahn; advisor to numerous startups and nonprofit organizations, Diane Lennon Powell; and the 43rd Treasurer of these United States, the Honorable Rosie Rios. So Anna, we've just been hearing about this implicit bias, and it's a key factor in this report, and it's your subject. So tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so let me start with kind of defining what unconscious bias is. The video explains it a bit, but unconscious bias or implicit bias is a bias that occurs outside of awareness or control. It can occur outside of awareness or control, therefore often unintentional. These biases impact our everyday judgment, decision, thoughts, behavior without we don't always know that it's occurring, but it is also very detrimental. So decades of research have shown that these unconscious biases put a lot of hurdles for individuals who are in the stigmatized groups. So
can you give us an example?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a few examples how it starts from the beginning to kind of a later stages in life. So one of the earlier studies they looked at is how we're impacted right off the beginning from these gender biases, which is that they took little kids, they showed a video of a little infant being scared, maybe angry, by Jack in the Box that pops up, and they just asked people, is this baby angry or scared? And same video, they just labeled the gender differently. This is a female baby, this is a male baby. And as you can guess, people almost always, if it's a male baby, that he was angry. If it's a female baby, she's scared. So almost immediately, we're kind of assigning these kind of different emotional states to babies and infants. And as we go through, you can see how this impacts our everyday life. But let's go through what happens. You go through college and school, and you're applying for a job. One of the most seminal studies in this area, what they did is they actually sent a job applications, same identical CVs, to male and female faculty members and asked, would you hire this person? Now, the CV is identical. The only thing they changed was the name. So it's a female name or male name. And they asked these actual faculty members, would you hire this person? And what they found is that identical CV, again, just want to emphasize that for female students, female students seem less competent, less hireable. They offered less salary, about $3,700 less. And that's over a lifetime. That's actually quite significant. And this happened despite the fact that people thought female students were more likable. It was just a kind of an odd effect. And again, both males and females do this. And if you look at studies on letters of recommendation, actually, these are real letters of recommendation that got sent in, and they got permission to look at this. And what you find is that letters of recommendation for women are much shorter, about 84% length than men. And these letters contain more reference to their home life, their personal life, more reference to their education rather than skill, and they have a lot more bet hedging, which is, it's amazing how much she's managed to accomplish. So it seems like a compliment, but at the end it's not. So you can see kind of even letters of recommendation show these biases. And I just want to kind of wrap this up a little bit, this kind of research section a little bit by talking about a study how these biases also apply to inanimate objects. This study is a little bit controversial, but some of you might have heard it. Female-named hurricanes are much more deadlier. And it's not because actually female-named hurricanes tend to be more powerful. It's that people find these female-named hurricanes less threatening and don't prepare as much. They don't seek shelter. And so people are twice likely to actually die in hurricanes. So these kinds of biases every day.
Even after Katrina.
That's actually a great point. This study actually excluded Katrina and Hurricane Audrey because they killed so many people. So they were seen as outliers and left out. And more feminine the name, more likely. So if the name is super feminine, it's 3 times as likely to kill.
Well, aren't there studies that show that if for instance, somebody's trying out for an orchestra, if they are not seen but just heard, that it makes a big difference in terms of gender?
Yes, so I'm pretty sure I got the percentage right. Something like 50% of women in orchestra being hired in orchestra accounts for by the blind auditions. And the anecdotal evidence talked about when after females audition and they come out from behind the kind of the curtain, people gasp. It's a woman, so yeah.
So Sally, implicit and explicit bias sometimes overlap, obviously. And can you talk about experience from your life when you found that to be the case?
Yes, I'm going to take this back to something that happened to me in the 70s, and it was when I was actually a college student, so that ages me, of course, but it happened to me then, and it's something I try not to let happen to me ever again, but I was putting myself through college, applying for my college loans. I missed a deadline. I went to my counselor, who happened to be a gentleman, a person of color. Here I was, this very frightened 21-year-old who missed my deadline, and I said, please help me. I missed my deadline for my financial aid if I don't get this application in. And he looked at me and he said, honey, you're young, you're cute, you're white, and you'll be fine. And I was like, okay, this will be one of the first and last times that anyone ever says that to me, because I had a struggle just as much as anybody else did to put myself through college. And I think in my years working for MTV, which was the great years, 20 years that I happened to be with the company, you know, from what I learned as a college student, I just really tried to carry that through in an environment in this television industry, media industry. I witnessed a lot. I tried to actually, you know, be part of a small group of people that tried to make change in a very creative environment. So I like to think that I kind of took what happened to me at a younger age and tried to conform people as I journeyed through my career.
But you know, you talk about that now. I was in college 10 years earlier, and the explicit bias was also legal, and that is a huge difference. So when I applied for jobs, it was we don't hire women to do that, often with hands on your knee, as they were saying it, and the 1964 Civil Rights Bill changed that. And when you talk about public policy and accountability, those are the kinds of things that really do make a huge difference, because once you have the law on your side, then you have recourse. And until you have that, you really have no place to go. I mean, the help wanted ads were white, colored, male, female.
Right.
And that was changed by this 1964 Civil Rights Bill. So that does make a huge difference when you have public policy.
Absolutely.
Mr. Bolin, you have certainly seen in your field, I'm sure, a sense of of who are these women coming in and trying to be astronauts, and what have you done about that? What do you see?
Well, if I
Send him to the moon.
If you ask what I've done, I've not done anything personally, but I am very proud to say that in the last group of astronauts selected, the 2013 class, we selected 8 out of 6,000 plus, 4 men, 4 women, and that was not saying we're going to select 50% men, 50% women. We said we're going to select the most qualified people, and so we ended up with 50-50. I have done things. If you go to NASA headquarters today, my deputy is female, the chief scientist is female. There are 3 males on what we call the A suite, and in the A suite there are a lot of people. It's in the teens. All of them are there because they're qualified, not because they were women. I think we're nowhere close to where we want to be, but we're a lot better off than we used to be.
And is that an effort? I mean, is that something that you're doing consciously in order to make the workplace a more
If you don't do it consciously,
workplace?
it doesn't happen.
Very good point.
I'm the diversity champion for NASA. If you ask anybody in our 18,000 person workforce, because we have what we call the D&I strategic partnership. It's the diversity and inclusion strategic partnership made up of the senior leadership of the agency. And I asked we have 9 centers around, like a city, around the country. We have 4 major directorates, and then offices that have an officer in charge or a person in charge. And so I asked each leader to designate somebody to be the diversity champion for their organization. I said, you don't have to be like I am. I am the diversity champion for the agency. And everywhere I go, whether it's inside NASA or outside, I consciously, particularly with industry, I tell them, if you do not consciously seek to instill diversity, and even more importantly, inclusion, because diversity without inclusion, and we hopefully will talk a little bit about that, you can have 75% women and 25% men and not believe in inclusion, and you may as well have none. Because inclusion means that you go to them for counsel, and when they speak, they're listened to, and they know they're going to be listened to.
I think we've all probably on this platform, and many of you in the audience have had the experience of being in a meeting and saying something, and then having a man say exactly the same thing that you just said. Is there an echo in the room? And then the other men at the table will say, "That's a great point." And you say, "Wait, but I just said that." And it happens all the time. It's quite remarkable. So I think your point is very well taken. But also you're in a field that it would seem to me that it would be harder for women. And Marion, you have been in that situation all of your professional life, of being in fields where women aren't normally the boss. And here you are now in head of Rolls-Royce America, and you see that effort of getting women into the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math. But how are we doing?
Well, I mean, we're doing better considering the fact that we're going, up from nowhere pretty much. No, I mean, you know, 20, 30 years ago, women in defense and aerospace was something of an unknown commodity. But it's in part real survival for us, because you've got to remember that women are a competitive advantage. Diversity and inclusion is not just altruism. It's not just because a lot of us believe in it. It also gives you an edge in terms of competing, and it's fierce out there. So we are huge on encouraging women to go into STEM disciplines as children, coming up. The water's fine, we tell folks, you know, and, you know, at this point, for example, in the aerospace and defense industry, you've got almost 20% women executives. Is that where it should be? Of course not. But is that a good thing? Absolutely. And I really believe in this area, as the Japanese say, if you're the nail that sticks up, you've got an advantage. People really do notice that you're there. So I guess that's a bit of a counterweight to some of the disadvantages.
But when you talk about how the fact that it is actually an advantage to the company, and that's got to be true in all kinds of ways. I mean, we do have studies showing that when you have women on a board, that the company, the bottom line is better. Not to mention the board behaves better, and all of that. So, Diane, what about that? Boards are so critical. They really do set the tone of an organization, and that's where we're still seeing a pathetic percentage of women.
It's still very...
And often it's the same woman who's on like 4 boards.
The overlapping boards for both men and women is disastrous. Mainly because there are so many more qualified people out there to do that. But I used to think that nonprofit boards would be one way, looking for a solution, would be one way for women to gain entry into the corporate board world by volunteering for audit committees or finance or the less popular ones, however that would go. Investments, which happens to be where I came up. But in fact, most professional recruiters will tell you that they do not believe that nonprofit board experience is transferable to corporate board experience. I do not understand that. I have asked any number of them why that's so. They just think that the for-profit motivation sets people aside. I absolutely disagree with that, because some nonprofits have hundreds of millions of dollars under management and hundreds of thousands of employees, and have the same kind of challenges, whether it be public relations or crisis management, that every other corporation has.
And as a member of nonprofit boards, you know, best practices are always something that you're having to pay a great deal of attention to.
And in fact, I have found them far more advanced on the diversity issues. Now, it is true that sometimes they will plot the course, and you get a grid saying, well, we want a this or a that, or a left-handed green Martian, forgive me, Charlie, whatever that might be on a chart, and that gets a little too sterile because people don't fit into those boxes necessarily neatly. But solutions, Cokie, because I believe that we can sit and complain and discuss, but to try and get to where we think we want to go, I have 2 that I'd like to propose. One is that every woman that any of us know who's on a corporate board, we sidle up to them as sisters and say, by this time next year, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had 1 more woman on that board you're on? And if you don't know qualified women, let us help each other find that person. But go to the chairman of that board or the CEO if they're stacking their board and say, you know, I'm lonely in the ladies' room.
Which is not the case in most of the world, right?
No, it really isn't. In fact, it's one place you don't have to stand in line normally, is corporate board ladies' rooms. I guess that's an advantage. We'll have to discuss that later. But the other thing that I've tried to do, and I would recommend strongly that we all try to do, is when we meet someone who's on a corporate board, and whether it's a holiday party or whatever it is, ask the question. You're on a corporate board, how many board members? 12. Seems to be between 12 and 18 is the sort of best practices. How many are women? 2? Well, you know what? I'll bet you have a need for someone on audit. Nobody wants to be on an audit committee. I'm not going to ask for myself, But I do know some really highly qualified women who need a sponsor. They need somebody to be their advocate. They need somebody to be out there. Would you be willing to do that? Now, most guys at a party are not going to agree to this, but at least you maybe pique their conscience. But to have it ready, to carry around at least psychologically a number of women who you would like to promote, because it's a little bit less aggressive, a word we don't like to use on ourselves. It's a little less aggressive if you're proposing this for someone else. So those are my at least 2 more immediate recommendations of how we might be able to get this ball advanced.
Ms. Rios, as a treasurer, you probably don't mind the audit committee, do you?
And you're after this career, I can get you on a board.
But I suspect you have been in the position of overcoming both sex and ethnic bias. So talk to us a little bit about that.
So I came from the private sector prior to coming to Treasury, and coming from California, where it was very progressive, inclusive, I never really thought about gender or ethnicity or orientation or anything along those lines. But DC is constituency-based, and so coming to this foreign land was a little bit of a wake-up call in many ways. I call myself lovingly the accidental feminist, because I really didn't have a lot of interest in these issues until I came here. But I do think it goes back to what someone said earlier about finding your sponsors, finding your champions. I was very fortunate to have worked with Secretary Geithner, who got it right away in terms of what I thought needed to happen. And so I'll never forget, it was January 2010, probably one of the most consequential times in our economic history, and I told him that I wanted to highlight the role that women were playing in the economic recovery. And at that time, 4 of the 6 economic decision makers were women. And here we are 1 year into the recovery, and we had Sheila Bair at the FDIC, Mary Shapiro at the SEC, Christina Romer at the Council of Economic Advisors, Elizabeth Warren at the time head of the Congressional Oversight Panel, and then the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I said to Tim, I said, all we're missing is you and Larry Summers. And I said, I would love to have an activity that honored the role that all women are playing in the economic recovery. And that March 2010 was the 30th anniversary of the National Women's History Project. And so I said, those 4 women that I just identified, I would love to have that be panel 1. Panel 2 would be the pioneers of Wall Street, Ab Joseph Cohen with Peratt, et cetera. And his immediate response, without hesitation, was, what can I do? How can I help? So those 4 women, by the way, were panel 1. They accepted my invitation. And that is what led to the May 25th, 2010 cover of Time magazine with the new Sheriffs of Wall Street. And the first paragraph highlighted this Women in Finance Symposium. And what's interesting about the symposium, which we just had our last one recently, is we actually never focus on gender issues. We focus on policy issues, and they just happen to be women talking about these policy issues. Now, this last one, because I felt like we built up enough equity to do so, we did talk about STEM, and we did talk about the future of our girls, because it is kind of forward-thinking. It was women in finance and technology, and so kind of, the last hurrah, maybe we'll continue, to focus on this isn't just about us, it's about our future. And so hopefully that is just one of many examples where Treasury has really been kind of a trailblazer in many of these areas. It was actually the Affordable Care Act that mandated that all federal agencies must have nursing facilities. And so we were actually the first agency right after that was passed to make that happen. So it was very, very exciting.
For
many
nursing
other
mothers.
examples. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. For those of us who remember what it was like to nurse in a stall, people don't realize how important it is to be valued and to feel like you have the physical facilities to do your job, basically.
You talked about being an accidental feminist, and that is an experience that's happened to an awful lot of women in policy positions. Women in Congress talk about it all the time, that they came to represent the 2nd District of Louisiana and find themselves representing the women of America because women come to them and tell them the specific difficulties that they're having, and then they take it forward. So what that does seem to imply is a consciousness that needs to be, I'm not talking about consciousness raising in the old-fashioned sense, but that people, as you said, Charlie, need to do this consciously. This cannot just be, oh, I think it's a great idea, So how do we go about that? Marion, you want to take it? Or Charlie, you want to take it? Go ahead.
one of the things
We'll let a man talk occasionally.
I mean, you know, since we're talking about STEM, a lot of our efforts are focused on encouraging women of color, people of color, actually, to understand that they can succeed in the STEM fields. One of the issues that we're working on right now, and interestingly, it came from 2 of the 3 men on our floor, is the fact that when we go out to recruit a woman for a position, a leadership position, the woman is more likely to say, you know, I'm not really sure that I can do that, or let me think about this. If I go ask a man, he doesn't have a clue what the job is, but he doesn't have the gall or the courage to say, can you tell me a little bit more about the job, and I'll think about it. So we consciously go out when we're looking for a woman that we want to fill a position, and spend a lot of time doing what Ron McNair did for me when I decided to apply for the space program, which he asked me if I was going to apply, I said, not on your life. And he said, why not? I said, they never picked me. And he looked at me and said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You know, how do you know if you don't ask? And so I found myself talking to grown, experienced women saying, would you consider this? I'm not really sure. And I said, you know, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. I would not be talking to you. I would not be asking you if I didn't think you were qualified. So again, I go back to we try to be conscious, and I'll use the word aggressive in our recruitment of women, because until you do that, and until you have this list that you can go to, if I go out and ask my leaders for a list of candidates for a position, I can almost guarantee you there won't be a woman on it. And it is not that they consciously are trying to exclude women, it's just that in their circle, almost everyone they know is a highly successful male. So having David Newman as my deputy, a former professor at MIT, when I asked for a list, David's list has some men on it, but it's got a lot of women. It's got a lot of very talented women. So that's the conscious effort to go out and get them.
And one of the reasons we keep talking about STEM, of course, is that today is actually the anniversary of the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and the reports on pay gaps all day today. And of course, one of the reasons overall in the pay gap is that women are not in the fields that pay the most, and that is what the STEM fields tend to be.
And I think that's a myth, by the way.
I
think it's an excuse.
And I want to come back to that with you, Anna, because I think there were a couple of things I was hearing there that I'm sure are part of your research. So, because we were hearing in the video that people are talking about changing women instead of changing policies and changing the workplace. Have you come across this hesitancy that Charlie was talking about in terms of women and putting themselves forward for leadership?
Yeah, so that's actually backed by research, and I'm going to quickly follow up exactly what you're talking about in terms of what we do at NIH. What the research shows is that men are more willing to kind of apply for a job. I know maybe in your case that wasn't true, but if there's a job whether they meet all the qualifications or not, they tend to just apply. It's just the way I think they've been taught. For women, what they show is that women wait till they meet every single qualification or even better before they apply. So, and by the time that women could be overqualified for some of the jobs that are being advertised because they make sure they have all the check marks. So if you don't try, if you don't ask, you don't get it. So that's part of the problem. So one of the things that we actually also kind of actively, consciously recruiting we do at NIH in the scientific workforce diversity is actively recruit people and try to dispel this myth of pipeline issues. Because when you do approach these individuals, say, have you considered women or minorities, underrepresented minorities for the position? Oh, well, they don't really exist. They're not out there. So what we actively do is we have a database. We have people who actively look for these individuals so we can dispel the myth that the pipeline issue is a problem. And we actually show up. And for these leadership positions, here are a list of women and underrepresented.
Binders full of women.
Yeah, literally binders full of.
I was trying not to use that.
Oh, I might have to use that because we literally hand over a binder. And say, here, that's a myth. And what we really try to do is see these people exist. You need to hire these individuals. And over time, what we're hoping happen is this whole mentoring issue. and role models, because you need to see these
I have a
individuals.
problem figuring out where these men are coming from. I mean, the truth is that I don't mean the men that are doing the hiring. I'm saying the men who are getting hired. When you have more than half of college graduates female and more than 2/3 of graduate school graduates female, who are the men? And why are they getting hired? Seriously. and when you talk about, I mean, I look at this from voting statistics perspective. When you're looking at white men over the age of 40, they're only about 25% of the population. So how does that square with a corporate boardroom?
Well, one of the things that I'm sure there's been a lot of research done on, because there are like 1.9 million hits on Harvard's library category of leadership. But leadership and language have such a really close and integral relationship to each other. And just 10 days ago, I was a fellow down at W&L for ethics and communications, and I found that the women were not using the same language as the men were in their presentations. And in fact, the women who were kind enough to allow some coaching were relying on you knows, likes. They were saying declarative sentences as if they were questions. I can't even do it, but it seems to be
upspeak.
It is an upspeak.
Yeah.
And the guys were not, some of them, most of them were not doing that at all. Language and leadership, choice of language and how you express yourself, and then the self-confidence. So I decided to take a little survey down there and said, who are the worst bosses you've ever had, both men and women? And what would be their commonality? And inevitably, it came down to self-confidence. The worst bosses, men or women, had the least self-confidence and therefore overcompensated in so many other actualizations. Women have a tendency to be self-deprecating. We want to be modest. See what I just did? I tilted my head. Well, have you ever watched people across a crowded room at a restaurant? The women are tilting their heads. That's how we're socialized to a large degree, but if we try, and I'm not saying that we should identify with men, because we're not men, but if we use their language in a self-confident way, if we don't rely on some kind of speech pattern that is considered weak at best, we're probably going to get closer to those leadership elements. It's just one of those kind of little secret, but nevertheless
But that can't be the whole thing.
No, of course not.
No, I don't think it is. Very interesting article in the New Yorker back in February about leadership and about assumptions about leadership. Is it trait-based, which does tend to bias toward men because we think of traits, all the way up from Hannibal and the elephants, all the way through, as being things that you kind of inherited. You got it or you don't. Versus process-based. You learn it, and you can learn in steps where women tend to do better. And one of the things that they found is that neither form particularly is more successful. The most common denominator is, have you been through a crisis? How you performed in a crisis. But that said, you also look at women, at leaders, and you will find a large base of women usually behind a lot of the people who we right now think of as terrific leaders. When they sort of come to mind, there's a cadre back there, and a lot of them are women. They could step up, no question.
I think going back to the question about, kind of the leadership role and kind of going with what we know. What usually happens with these networks, so there's some structural frameworks that kind of encourage the same type of hiring, because unfortunately, women don't access those networks as much as men do. Whether it is your metropolitan club, your city club, your country club, people tend to hire from people that they've worked with before, people that they were in a fraternity or a finals club or anything along those lines. And so if you're in a world of finance, those opportunities are going to be few and far between, because those employers might not have had the same type of base that included a lot of women. So, and I certainly have found that, in my field in finance. And so it's a comfort level that people tend to have. Sure. And it is kind of a loyalty piece, it's a trust piece. And if we're not part of that network, part of those connections, then we are going to be disadvantaged.
But the company's going to be disadvantaged if it doesn't represent the people that it is selling to and serving and all of that. I mean, we have a good bit of data to support that. So why is there such hesitance?
I just want to say I think a lot of this just is very individual. I mean, when you have to make a living and you are driven by making a living, earning a living, that's the whole gap that we have salary-wise. When it's a necessity that you have to support your family and you have to pay your mortgage or get your car, whatever you need to do, I feel like, you know, part of that's a necessity as an individual. So when it comes to seeing a hole somewhere, I mean, in our world, in the entertainment industry, I dealt all the time in a man's world. I mean, part of my job was dealing with leagues and the NFL and NBA and MLB, and I worked on Super Bowls, and very often I was the only woman in a room. Well, I didn't sit back and be like, I'm the only woman in the room. I welcomed other women in the room and encouraged other women to join me in the room, or really just encouraged my own self, the self-confidence to speak loudly and to be a good leader. And even if you are in a room with men, I need this job just as much as you do. And I also watched some of my coworkers leave their space, and I saw a hole. And I was like, okay, that person is moving out of that job. I want that job. I am going to move into that job. And I think we have to teach the younger girls these days to do more of that. I think we have to teach our daughters how to be more independent. I think we have to keep our confidence levels very high and not live in the past, but live right now in the future. And it's just a lot of our responsibility in how we're bringing up the next generation.
But again, this is telling it's in some ways, you know, blaming the victim. I mean, it's telling the women that they have to step up and change, and that's fine. But isn't it also true that that as the video was making the point, the policies need to change and the workplace needs to change? I mean, it seems to me when you are talking about, again, the best and the brightest, the people coming out of college and graduate school being female, that if you do not have a caretaker-friendly workplace, and by caretaker I don't just mean little children, that you are then putting people in a position where they have to choose between responsibilities, and when you do that, you're driving away wonderful workers, and it seems to me that puts you in a non-competitive position as an industry or as a school or as a political party or whatever it is. And so that's not the little girl changing, that's the place changing. So, Marion, do you see, you know, people responding to those kinds of needs?
I do. I mean, Rolls-Royce is willing to spend real money on those kinds of accommodations. I also think it's important that we encourage employees to pull together. We have big emphasis, Charlie, on diversity and inclusion. And we ask women, for example, pull a group together in your workplace and tell us more about what you need, encourage each other, have a place that people who are interested in being mentors and vice versa can actually go as a, you know, place that's really a force in the group itself, because it can't be all top down from the company. I mean, we're lucky. We have a very good number of women on Rolls-Royce's board, for example. But it won't go just one way. You've got to pull it together from both ends.
At NASA, we use employee resource groups.
That's what we call ours.
Every center, it depends, and it's totally dependent because every center has its own culture. We've got 9 centers around the world, so an employee resource group at Stennis down in the Mississippi Delta is going to be really different than one, say, out here in Greenbelt, Maryland. But the center director, who's the mayor of that center, is at the liberty of saying, I have a large number of Hispanics in my workforce, so I need a Hispanic employee resource group. Or I have maybe not a large number, maybe not a large enough number of LGBT people, so I'm going to have an LGBT employee resource group. Johnson Space Center, for example, several years ago, because they do have an LGBT employee resource group, they did a video that went viral. And it was about acceptance of people in the workforce for who they are and what they can do. And the center director, was a part of doing that video. Because she thought it was critically important for her as a straight woman to be there, helping people understand the critical importance of what these people were to her center, because she wants to be competitive. And if I want NASA to stay #1, I need a diversity of ideas. We're in a battle today with our international partners.
Sure.
Frequently, it's not competition for the way we think about it. It's competition of ideas. If I've got African Americans, Hispanics, women, people who go through a lot of different life experiences.
Old people.
I don't even talk about age. Age is immaterial, to be quite honest. And I try not to use the term young employees. We talk about new hires or people who don't have the prior experience in what we're doing, particularly when you talk about veterans. You may get a veteran that's 50 years old, but doesn't really know the organization. But the depth of ideas that you get from that person and what they bring makes us the best place in the world, and that's really important to us. We want to be #1, and we want to do things that nobody else can do. That's what NASA does. And when you talk about making the impossible possible and turning science fiction into science fact, you can't take the same people, the same old people that have done everything, or you'll never get there.
So we have some questions that have come in from emails, and the first one says, I've experienced discrimination several times in my career, some of it very blatant. What suggestion do you have for women who have been actively discriminated against in the workforce? You want to take that?
Well, speak up and report it to begin with. I'll tell you, this
But
is.
doesn't that have its own problems? I mean,
Right.
for those, at least,
complaining.
however you get tagged, the first person who complains normally gets labeled. And to be labeled means that some other guy, Marion, we can bat this around. I'd love to know some solutions, but I think people, it doesn't matter, just women, people are afraid to stand up because they don't want to be a troublemaker.
I think that's true, and I think that nevertheless means that we have to have courage in these circumstances, because the organization, the company, the corporation really has to investigate, look, and back up the people where there's legitimacy in it. It's not a question of a choice. Now, I agree with you. Being labeled, there is a liability in it. Sitting back and saying, well, hope it doesn't happen to anybody else and I'll get around it, is an easier thing to do. But I think these days as women, we really do have to recognize we've got an obligation. It's not just to us, it's to a lot of other people out there.
And the company has a liability in that situation.
Exactly.
So the next one is the pay gap. How does the pay gap between men and women affect women's incentive to strive for leadership roles? That's an interesting question.
Ask for more. Just keep asking, and I think if you don't talk about it and you don't bring it up and you're not assertive, then it'll just be, just be passed. I also think there's more women, there's more single women raising families these days, and the whole wage salary gap really has to be considered in all organizations, for sure.
So there's a woman in the audience that I would like to recognize as my first mentor, Madeline Jennings, who has been very active here in the museum. And she was the head of HR for Gannett, one of the most advanced in all of these senses corporations that people have ever known. But also HR takes a big part of this responsibility, or can take a big part of this responsibility as well. And when you have someone who is enlightened and such a champion, it's so much easier. So Madeline, hats off.
It's great. But that's true. That mentor role makes a huge difference. But do you find in the research, Anna, that people say, well, why bother to go for this, because it's just not going to do me that much good anyway?
I'm not aware of that research. What we do know is that people often don't realize that discrepancy exists. This is why trying to make the pay scale. I mean, they've heard of it,
They
but
find out.
yeah, they think, oh, it doesn't happen to me. So, this is why making the pay scale kind of transparent. If you're in a kind of the federal sector, you can actually go look up what your colleagues colleagues are making. So, unless you go look it up, and you have to ask for it. Things are, it's kind of going back to the blame the victim, but it's you do have to ask for it, and the administration and whoever's from the top down have to make this pay very transparent.
I really think it's about changing the dialogue. This is an economic issue. Anyone who understands the numbers should think about this as an investment. The operative word is growth, growth, growth. And the only way you're going to get growth is by expanding the pie. And so if you think about this as an investment in an employee who's going to hopefully stay longer, who's hopefully going to feel valued and feel like they have an interest in the success of the company, that's kind of changing it not just from the victim's perspective, but from the company's perspective.
Right, that's what I was saying earlier about it puts you in a weaker position competitively if you're not able to attract and retain these talented people called women.
I also think as women, you have to make a choice. If you're a parent and you know that you're going to miss out on some of the activities of your children because you're working, if you're at that same salary level as the man, you're going to work just as hard, and you are going to make the concessions. You're going to make those choices that I am going to pursue my career. I am going to work harder for this company because I have enough money that I can have daycare, or I can bring my kids to daycare. Or I remember, frustration times taking the train home one day going like, how much money does it cost me to go to work? Between commuting, insurance, my car, New York City cost, it added up. It was something like $30,000 a year when I added up what it costs for my nanny and my clothes and my travel and my commuting. And I was like, wow, is this really worth it? So if you're going to attract women in the workplace that are going to maintain leadership roles and continue to grow in your company, you have to compensate them so that they can take care of what has to happen in the home front.
Although I've noticed that now that men notice that they have children, that they
yes, the husband, and also a big part of this.
The other men in the workplace, that they'll say, I'm sorry, I've got to go to the soccer game, which in a million years I wouldn't have done. I snuck off to the soccer game. I'm sorry, I've got to go to the Senate Library right now. But now they're sort of giving permission for the women to do it.
You hit the nail on the head, and I can speak as I'm the senior person in NASA. If I don't have, my two kids are grown. My son is married, has 3 beautiful daughters, so I'm the grandfather for 3 girls. And everybody in my workplace knows if I miss one of my granddaughter's events, I'm not a happy camper. So I try to make as many as I can. I'm blessed that they're in this area, but I feel that it's incumbent upon me to set the example. And I tell people all the time, look, get your priorities straight. You're going to miss something that your daughter or your son is going to do. That event is never going to occur again.
Right.
Yep. Never. I sometimes I cry when I talk because as a Marine, I can't get back what I missed when my kids were growing up.
Yeah.
And so I don't want women to be like women used to be when I was growing up. They've got to be normal people. And I mean, everything is simple. Everything sounds simple, but it's hard to do. And so I think if I set the example and I demand that they go do it and tell them, I want you to go do this, then they'll be more prone to do it. I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders, since we're talking about women leaders, men have a responsibility. You talked about there are 2 people that make a kid, okay? And this is, as an African-American male in my community, growing up from the moment I can remember in South Carolina, the strong people in the community were the women. They raised the family, they worked and raised
all
the family.
White kids.
And raised it, sometimes they did. So it's just, we got to make it happen.
But I want to point out there's an implicit bias in all of this. There's such thing as the father benefit and the mother penalty. So research shows that fathers, when they have kids and do these family kinds of things, are treated better and think they're better workers, better co-workers. But when women do the same thing, there's now a mother penalty while she's not working. So we have to be very cognizant of this is that implicit bias that's kind of in the air that's impacting all of us.
We have a Facebook question. I'm a sophomore in college, and I don't see much evidence of gender bias affecting me. How do I prepare for the gender bias I hear happens in the workplace? My reaction to this is, just you wait till I
It's probably happening. It's just hard to detect. This is what implicit, I bet you're, I don't know, whoever you are, you're probably, sorry, sad news, you're probably experiencing it right now, you're just not detecting it. It's just under the radar.
But it's also true that at the entry level, it is much easier to, I mean, sometimes we're desperately looking for a boy because, these bright young women are coming out of college, and the girls are women and the boys are boys, the men are boys. And so at that level, it's much easier. It's as you start to move up that you start to see.
Well, that's when the structural framework is so important, right? The conditions, the work conditions, the supportive environment, whatever it is, it takes these women the choice to hopefully, if they decide to have a family, that there's a welcome mat there for them if they want to come back.
This is from Twitter. As a woman of color, I know bias affects me more than my white female colleagues. Given the current political climate, can someone comment on when you think that's likely to change?
Oh dear. That shouldn't be funny.
That isn't funny.
But likely to when is a hard question to answer. Whether isn't probably a better one. Anybody want to take that?
Well, if there were more men like Charles Bolden who were in leadership positions, it will all change.
Right. But seriously, are we in a moment when it's regressing rather than progressing?
Yes. Yes. I had a conversation with someone. My special assistant out here is a young White House fellow, LaShonda Holmes, who's a Coast Guard lieutenant and helicopter pilot. And I was privileged to be at a dinner for her in her class last night, and at our table we were talking about it. And I was saying, as a member of the Obama administration and a person of color, I worry. I would have never thought that we would see things happening the way they are today once we got as far as we got. And the other conversation I had was that, and again, this is for young black men and women who have been complaining about the president not doing enough. Mm-hmm. I think as they now look at the fact that he is now about to not be the president, and some of us have grandchildren and children who are beginning to say, wait a minute, what do you mean that the president's not going to be black? That is something that young, and it will hopefully it will be the same way when we have the first female president, that as the end of that term comes up, young women will say, whoa, there's no woman running. How can that be?
Well, it happened with Secretary of State. It was so funny. I mean, Madeleine Albright became Secretary of State, and it was all, first, can a woman actually do the job? Will foreign leaders talk to her? All that stuff. And then Condoleezza Rice takes the job, and by the time Hillary Clinton's Secretary of State, people start saying to me, is there something about Secretary of State that makes it especially good for women to do it? Is it sort of a women's job? And well, there have been three since Thomas Jefferson, but but it's a funny thing how that does transition. Yeah. This is an interesting question from Twitter. How can women balance competing against each other for leadership roles while promoting each other in the same pursuits?
Interesting. I mean, listen, I think as women in leadership roles, it's also our responsibility to look out for each other, and it's also our responsibility to look out for people of color, as well as, we live in a fragmented society now. It's not just men and women. We have gay men, lesbians, transgenders. We have so many mixtures of combination of families and how we're bringing up our children. So In my opinion, women really have to look out for each other, and it is our responsibility. And I think that's also kind of one of those old cliches about, women being bitches or, cattiness or all that stuff that happens. But I really feel like that's actually changed quite a bit.
I've never experienced, I've been in the workplace for 50 years, and I have not experienced that
Right.
at all. I've much more had the experience of...
Look out for each other.
Right.
May I offer one observation? And all the time, and this is to all of the women in the audience. If you're in a position to hire, everybody's not as good as you are. You weren't as good as you are when you started. So give them a break. Mm-hmm. Don't be selfish and say, I worked really hard to get here, and I don't want them to screw it up. As a person of color, I find myself doing that a lot. I worked really hard to get here, and I don't want another black male not to have this opportunity because I don't want to put someone in here who's going to be weak and not measure up. Well, guess what? I didn't have a clue when I came into this job. I'm a non-political political appointee. And the person right here really helped me before I even got considered for this because I was on one of her advisory committees and I watched her. She didn't have to say anything. I just watched her and the way she handled herself in this male-dominated world. So, when you get right down to it, I'm no different than a female. I told Diane, I can bring out my feminine side here. I represent something that is not the standard in this city. And so for me to think that I'm any different than you or Marion or anybody else and that, that you're not going to go through the same thing I am, that's foolish. And that's why I say we need to mentor and we need to allow people to come in and work with us and grow from that. I've had my granddaughter, my now 16-year-old granddaughter, shadow me at work so that she can see, what it's like and what she can do one of these days. So.
Several of the questions actually have been about mentoring, and since you all have all referenced it, I didn't bring it up separately, but it is clearly a huge part of leadership, of taking a leadership role and then educating for a leadership role. This question says, what do you do when, as a woman, you are the smartest and most experienced person in the room, but constantly get outvoted? Democracy can be a problem. If it's a vote, I don't think there's much you can do, is there? No.
The only thing is that sometimes it helps to have a conversation before the vote, a little bit off record, or maybe do some lobbying if you know something is really important to you. If it's not critical, then it's true, it's democracy. But if it is critical, then I'll take you aside and go, I have a feeling that you and I aren't going to agree on this, but maybe it's because the reasons haven't been adequately explained. You got a minute? Got 5 minutes? Whatever. It's the only other thing you could possibly...
But if you think you're the smartest person in the room, you're probably not a great lobbyist.
Yeah, there may be, Cokie, a little bit of a problem with the question. If you really think you're the smartest person in the room, you probably aren't. So,
Right.
you have to be careful about that.
Sure.
It also goes back to doing your homework. You have to plan ahead. And so hopefully, I'm going to use this one example. So you probably know that we've been working on this currency redesign project.
Right.
So as the lead on this project, it was basically focusing on how currency is redesigned historically and following the process that was used. And in this particular instance, the theme of democracy was the overriding consideration for all denominations. So getting to the point where you could define democracy and leading up to, in this case, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote in 2020, it all kind of fell into place.
Right.
It wasn't an affirmative action issue. It was male or female, the democracy theme, and knowing that we were leading up to this count up made it very, I wouldn't say easy, but it was it definitely was easier to get to yes.
It was more obvious.
It was more obvious, absolutely.
Well, I shed no tears for Alexander Hamilton. He was terrible to his wife and children. And Anne left her in terrible debt. So how good a treasurer was he after all? I mean, Secretary of the Treasury. This one is similar to some degree. How do I react when someone mansplains to me and takes away my authority as a leader? Now that is, I mean, mansplains, it's a new term. I've actually even heard it, and if I've heard it, it's not all that new. But I mean, I see the point is basically diminishing someone, and that does happen.
I believe that the behind-the-scenes lobbying or individual conversations and creating individual relationships one-to-one is really very, very important. Social media, unfortunately, I think, and fortunately, has really changed our communications. It used to be, let me just walk down the hall and open the door and talk to somebody. I know I'm going into a meeting today. I have something I really believe in. I want to get everybody in that room to follow my belief. So the one-to-one conversations that happen even before you enter that room, I think are very valuable. Well, now it's very different. Now it's an email blast that goes out. Now it's texting. Now it's bad-mouthing, or it's posting something on Facebook. Like, it's very different communications, and I believe that our old-school communications factor of one-to-one conversations and really being able to lobby your opinions are incredibly still a very valuable way to run a business and to communicate with your staff as well as anyone on a committee.
Do you have any kind of rules about things like that? I mean, do you, in your places of work, do you allow people to Twitter around about each other? Tweet around about each other?
You can have your own policy. I think you can have policies and you can have room. I mean, it's hard enough to keep people off the computer all day looking at social media for half their day. I mean, one of the hardest parts is just like, you're here for 8 to 10 hours, you're working. Please don't spend an hour of it, roaming around the web or checking out what's going on with your Facebook friends. But I think it's really hard to instill policy that,
It's hard to have a dinner party
Yeah.
without people who are and I know they're not praying. At least before the meal, if not after the meal. But these safe zones are almost impossible anymore. And the only other thing that I'd be curious about the group is whether, and maybe this is a default position, but the role that humor can play to try and diffuse some of this. It's always the after action, like, wish I had said that, or I wish that I had been able to be quick enough to bat it back, but with a different tonality rather than defensive. But humor it seems to be able to cure a lot of ills if you can fit it in. And if the guys in the room have a sense of humor, which we're maybe don't have.
But humor and sense of humor on social media can also,
Right.
very often be misunderstood.
Who knows what?
Right, so we also have to be careful of the humor.
Yeah, I always want transcripts to read, Mrs. Roberts rolled her eyes.
Well, we are doing a virtual, I heard a great term the other day, virtualization of relationships. Virtualization of relationships. So instead, as you were saying, Sally, of walking down the hall and sitting in somebody's chair and having this conversation, it all is being translated without nuance, without tonality. It's hard to know half of the time what people are meaning, and then you reduce it to 140 characters.
Right.
Oh my gosh, it's fast.
Rosie, you referred to this in one of your answers, but it's very explicit. What about re-entry women? Would you hire a woman with great potential and qualifications, but a big working gap? And where do they enter the leadership pipeline?
The answer is yes. Of course, absolutely. I mean, some would like to think, I mean, I was very fortunate. I had my mom with me, but I would like to think that even if a woman decides to take a certain time off, that doesn't mean they were out of this world.
Right.
There is definitely a level of growth that happens no matter what you do, no matter whether you decide to take care of kids, whether you decide to take a sabbatical, whether you decide to write, whatever it is, that's not necessarily lost time. I mean, this is kind of a redefining of how we think about people and how we think about skill sets and kind of the emotional intelligence that comes with being a valued asset. So for me, absolutely, there's no reason why people can't contribute to the workforce in some way, even if they take time off. Hopefully they're in a healthy place in their mind, probably better than they would have been otherwise.
I always said that motherhood was my best preparation for covering Congress. Do you?
Humor.
Oh, yeah, no kidding.
I've actually found a lot of consultants. I think we also, women in the workforce, there's a lot more consultants. There's a lot of women that are now becoming specialists. And because we can work virtually, I actually have quite a few women that have come back to work part-time or with flexible hours or work a couple days a week from home or leave early because they've got to pick up their kids at school. And I think that's totally acceptable now. I think that's a whole thing in the workforce that's 100% acceptable.
Some places and not others. That's the problem.
Correct. And that is another women in leadership, because I think
And also that, I mean, we're talking about leadership more, but that solution generally is very difficult for women at the lower end of the pay scale. Women who are on an assembly line or women who are in a position where it's very hard for them to have that kind of flexibility, and often they're the people who need it the most.
that's absolutely true.
This gets to some of what you were referring to, Charlie, earlier. If a woman is president this time around, will there be a backlash against women leaders?
How did it work for President Obama?
Did it right.
What do you...
I think there will be some people, who will not be willing to accept that, just as there have been lots of people who are still not willing to accept a black president. But I think for someone to be resilient and strong enough to take all the slings and arrows, you let your performance do the talking for you. And that's my counsel to anybody, whether they're male, female, or anything. Please, whatever you do, don't let someone define you. Don't let someone tell you how well you're doing. If your workforce is doing well, then you're okay. The measure of a leader is not the leader. I believe, the measure of a leader is in the performance of the organization that they lead and the happiness. I mean, it's a silly word maybe, but is my workforce enjoying themselves? Do they enjoy themselves? And if I leave, will anybody miss me? And when I leave, hopefully no one will miss me, and that will be the best indication that I was a halfway decent leader, because it will mean that I have mentored, I have put people in place who, whether they agree with what I'm doing or not, they at least will adopt some of my leadership styles that say, take care of your people, and they will take care of you. And so
they'll miss you, Charlie.
So no, that's not. The point is, a woman president who leads this nation and is able to bring disparate people together in spite of themselves. That's the tough part of being in this town, is to try to bring people together who don't want to be a part of the team.
So at the beginning we heard, this is not a problem that can be solved by time. It has to be solved by action. And I think that we've heard a lot of suggestions of action, but is there anything finally that any of you wants to point to that you think would be an action that really would make a difference? Does the research show anything, Anna?
So things like awareness, this whole event, awareness and the motivation to change can really change. Because if you don't know that this is happening, you can't start the change. And kind of going back to the earlier question about women president, if you have a role model, people are more likely to follow that role model. The first few people are going to be very difficult. It's called motivated cognition. So for example, African-American president, when he does well, he's male, but then when he does bad, he's African-American. So people can choose their stereotypes. Same goes for women, but over time these things change. But again, I think events like this, awareness, raising awareness, telling people we can change is actually, and research does show that these kinds of interventions do work.
Can I just give one great example of that? So awareness is absolutely key. I'll never forget when we launched this public engagement process for our currency redesign initiative in August of this last summer. I got an email from my high school history teacher. And it was the first day of the school year, and I hadn't taken his class in 32 years, and he's still there 35 years later. And he said he walked into his classroom, which was the first day of the school year, Mr. Wilder. And he said he realized when he walked into his classroom that of all the years he's been teaching, he had no images of women on his walls, and he wanted to change it. And so he invited me back, and I went in October. And I walked into his classroom, and there on the wall was, Susan B. Anthony and Harriet Tubman and me. And it dawned on me, if you had one teacher or 100 teachers or 1,000 teachers who did the same thing. My daughter's a 15-year-old sophomore. Can you imagine her walking into the classroom in her science class or her math class? And it changes the perspective. It changes that awareness, not just for girls, but for boys.
Right.
So we value what we see every day. And so if you don't see that every day, and if you do see it every day, what will that do?
I write women's history, and I wrote a children's book of one of my history books, and went around to schools talking about it, and said to the kids, in all those pictures, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, anything missing? And the little boys will say something crazy. And then some little girl will raise her hand and say, women, there are no women in those pictures. And I'll say, do you think there were women then? And they got all embarrassed and giggly. But I say, they say, yes, there were women then. I say, how do you know? There are no pictures of them. And there really aren't. And then they say, because there couldn't have been men without women. Marion, you look like you were ready to hop in here.
I also think that it is incumbent upon us as executives, as leaders of both sexes, to be very explicit about that we care about diversity, it does matter, and in point of fact, we really are going to work to make sure both the pipeline is coming and we're actively seeking candidates. But you have to talk about it. You have to, don't assume everyone says, yes, it's a universal good, and we're all of like minds. Maybe yes, but let's all put it right out there, in front of us on the table. And I don't think we do enough of that, to tell you the truth.
Absolutely. It's setting expectations high for little girls, for high school girls, for college girls. People who, and you're the behavioral scientist, but it seems that people who are taught that there's nothing they can't achieve go on to achieve great things.
Right. There was one term that I liked in the report, counter-stereotyping, and I've been married for almost 29 years, and I have a husband who really supports what I do, and I think on the same time we're talking about women in leadership, we have to really acknowledge the husbands, the men, the boys. We have to teach our boys about the list in the house. There's like things to do, and it doesn't matter whether you're the husband or the wife, the male or the female. It's a shared responsibility, and there's more and more men now that are staying home because maybe their women are working, and I happen to be a working woman growing up with a lot of stay-at-home moms, and the husband was going to more events than I was, and I think we have to consider that as well. I think we have to really support and teach our young men as well that, there really is a shared responsibility now, and it enables everyone to have an opportunity.
Well, this has been a wonderful ability to raise the awareness, and the report itself is an excellent report that we commend to all of you to read. So thank you all on the panel very much. It's been enlightening and entertaining. And before we go, I'd like to thank our host for the evening, the AAUW, and welcome their National Board Chair, Patricia Ho, for some final words.
We really want to extend our deepest appreciation to Cokie and to each one of our esteemed guests. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, for coming from your different spheres of influence to give us your ideas, your thoughts, your expertise, your experience on leadership, because that's actually what you have been and what you are inspiring us to do. Now, Cokie started off with some pretty bleak numbers, and we know those numbers, we've heard them so often. But you know, the whole tone, I think, of the report and of the final outcomes of your conversation was that indeed there are strategies, there are actions that we can take, all working together, and you all alluded to that, so that people who are in policy making, in corporate and industry, in the nonprofit world, people who are in communities working in different levels, all have a stake in this. We can all do something to advance not only women in leadership, but better changes for our world. And I think it's something that we all need to be working together. And so I have to say that for decades, AAUW's cutting-edge research has really been a focal point for our public policy work, for our programs, for whatever we do at the local, state, and national levels, indeed international levels. And I know that you're all aware not only now of barriers and bias, the status of women in leadership, but also of our STEM research, campus harassment, and pay equity. We have been very active in this, and we owe our very great thanks to our members, our supporters, to the Muneen Lychee Giving Circle for continuing all of this work. I do want to extend thanks to our AAUW national staff, to our CEO, Linda Hallman, to all the staff who are working here, and especially to our research team, Dr. Catherine Hill, Dr. Kevin Miller, Kathleen Benson, and to our national board. We really appreciate all the work and support, considering, you know, that we are a membership organization and we rely not only on our national staff, but also on our volunteers everywhere at the grassroots level. And so what can each of us do? We can read the report. And it's not that long, but you know what? It's inspirational reading, because that impels us to go on and do something at whatever level we can do. Read the report, follow the conversation on Lead Her Ship, and check out www.aauw.org. And so I want to thank, again, Cokie, and each one of you. It was a delight to speak with each one of you backstage in the green room, which is really white. But thank you also, everyone who live streamed in, all of you here who participated with us. And we have to remember that we're all working together. We all have to join the chorus of change for a better life. And thank you so much for joining us on behalf of AAUW and our partners. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our event today. For more information, visit www.aauw.org.